Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here. Now, most of the stories we tell on this channel follow a familiar shape. Man leaves home. Man finds the Philippines. Philippines finds his wallet. Everyone learns something expensive. And those stories are real, and they matter, and we'll keep telling them. But every so often we get something different. A story that doesn't end in a wire transfer gone wrong or a confrontation outside a barangay at 2 in the morning. A story where the disaster almost happened, where all the conditions were perfectly arranged for it to happen, and then, just barely, it didn't. This is one of those. Brendan is 65 years old. He's from Limerick, in the west of Ireland. He spent 32 years as a Garda, that's the Irish National Police, and he retired with a pension, a quiet house, and an absolutely unshakable belief that he understood people better than most. He'd earned that belief. Professionally, at least. What drew him to the Philippines is something he'll tell you about himself. What he found there, and what it showed him about himself, that's the part that's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll tell you something about 32 years in the Garda. You come out the other side believing you can read anyone. Not arrogant about it, just certain. The way a carpenter's certain about wood. You develop a feel for it. The man who sits too still in the interview room because he's concentrating on sitting still. The woman whose story is slightly too complete, too rehearsed, no gaps in it. Real memories have gaps. People forget what color jumper they were wearing. Liars always know. I was good at it. I won't pretend otherwise. What I was considerably less good at, it turns out, was reading myself. But we'll get to that. I retired at 63 November, it was. Cold gray Limerick morning. Handshakes from the lads. A card with a fishing joke on it because apparently that's what you do when you don't really know a man. Drove home to a house that had been getting quieter by degrees for 4 years and just sat in it. The Garda pension isn't bad. I'm not complaining. Between that and what I'd managed to put away over the years, I was comfortable enough. Not rich. Comfortable. There's a difference, and that difference matters for everything I'm about to tell you. The tree marriages. That's the other thing you should know about me before we go any further. 3. Not something I lead with at parties, as you can imagine. The first one, Siobhan, that ended when the children were still small. She said the job had made me unreachable, which was probably true. The second, Patricia, lasted 7 years. She found someone who... And the third, Deirdre, walked out 4 years before I retired. And that's the one I don't have a clean story about yet. The first 2 I can explain. Deirdre I'm still working on. 5 children across those 3 women. Good kids. They turned out fine, which, I'll be honest with you, is more their mother's doing than mine. They're scattered now, Dublin, London, one in Melbourne. At Christmas I'm lucky to hear from 2 of them, and even then it's a voice message, not a call. I'm not bitter about it, I say that. I've said it so often in the last few years that I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter. Like if you repeat a thing enough times, it becomes true. A detective would clock that immediately. I clocked it about 18 months after I retired, sitting in my kitchen, looking at a table that used to seat 6 and now seated 1, and realizing that a man who genuinely isn't bitter doesn't feel the need to tell himself so 4 times a week. The house. I should tell you about the house. It's a terrace on Ballinacurra Road. 3 bedrooms that I have absolutely no use for. The second bedroom has my boxes in it. Boxes from when Deirdre left and I moved things around and never quite moved them back. The third I keep the door closed on. The living room has a television. I watch too much. A sofa. I sleep on more than I should, and on the wall this rectangular patch where the light's a slightly different shade than the rest of the paint. That's where her mirror was. I'm not a self-pitying man. I want to be clear about that. I don't sit in the house weeping. I go for walks. I meet shadows. But there's a particular quality of silence in a house that used to have people in it. And if you've lived it, you know exactly what I mean, and if you haven't, there's no way to properly explain it. It's not peaceful silence. It's the other kind. That was me at 63. Retired Garda, pension in the bank, 5 children who treated me more or less like a bill they'd already paid, and a theory. The theory being that I had finally, definitively, worked out what I'd been doing wrong with women across 3 marriages and several decades. I had analyzed the evidence. I was ready. The pension was real. The theory was not. But I didn't know that yet. That bit came later. What came first was a Wednesday night in February. 11:30. Jameson on the table. Not too much, I'm not that cliché, and the television on something I wasn't watching, and then the phone, and then YouTube, doing what YouTube does at 11:30 when you're 63 and alone, and the algorithm has had long enough to figure out what you are. The first video was a travel thing. Some lad in his 50s showing you around Cebu on a motorbike. Very fair play to him. I watched 3 more before I went to bed. I watched 7 the next night. Within a week, I had a fairly comprehensive unofficial education in the Philippines as a concept, the islands, the people, the cost of living, the weather, God, the weather. I cannot tell you what it means to a man from Limerick to watch footage of consistent sunshine, the English. Everyone speaks English, which matters more than people admit when you're a monoglot Irishman who did 4 years of schoolboy Irish and nothing else. Thailand came up early in the algorithm. I told myself, and I told Sean later when he asked, that Thailand had a certain reputation, and I wasn't interested in that sort of thing. Which was true. But it was also true, and I'm being honest with you here, that I didn't want to be seen as the sort of man who goes to Thailand. There's a difference between not wanting to do a thing and not wanting to be seen doing a thing, and those 2 things are not always the same thing. I understood this distinction from the job. Somehow I missed it when it applied to me. The Philippines felt different. Catholic country, I'm not particularly devout, haven't been since about 1987, but there's a cultural familiarity in it, a shared grammar almost. Family-oriented, more conservative in its way. I wasn't wrong about any of that. I just hadn't asked myself the more important question, which was, Brendan, why are you researching this at all? What exactly is it you think you're looking for? I didn't ask that question. Not yet. Instead, I joined a Facebook group. The group was called something like Philippines Expats and Travelers, Real Talk, or I joined on a Thursday morning with a cup of tea and the vague intention of finding out what the visa situation was for a tourist and maybe which islands were worth seeing. That was the intention, anyway. The first few days were genuinely useful, I'll give it that. Someone had written up a detailed post about extending a tourist visa. You get 30 days on arrival, but you can extend it at the Bureau of Immigration. Costs around $30,500 each time, which works out to about 55, and you can keep doing it for up to 3 years, in theory, though most people leave and practical information. The kind of thing I'd have needed to know. I read it twice and saved it. There were cost of living threads that were helpful too. A decent apartment in Cebu City, not luxurious but clean and air-conditioned, was running somewhere between $19,000 and $35,000 a month, roughly $290 to $50-60. Food was cheap if you ate locally, more expensive if you insisted on eating like you were still in Europe, which apparently a lot of them did and then complained about. One man was spending $800 on a full meal at a carinderia, a local canteen basically, plastic chairs and a steel counter. and another was spending 4 times that at a Western-style restaurant in BGC in Manila and wondering why his savings were shrinking. The cop in me noted this without meaning to. People rarely see their own patterns. But within about 4 days, the pattern recognition really started firing. Not about the Philippines. About the men in the group. I want to be careful how I say this, because I'm not stating, but there were types. Distinct, recurring, identifiable types. The kind you could have built a training manual around. The first one I clocked was what I started calling, in my own head, the Bitterman. You'll know him immediately if you've ever been in one of these groups. His profile photo was him holding a bottle of San Miguel, taken somewhere tropical, squinting into the sun. He'd been in Cebu for 8 years. 8 years. And in those 8 years, based on his posting history, the Philippines had apparently failed him in every conceivable way. The women were scammers. All of them. The corruption was unbelievable. The traffic, the noise, the bureaucracy. Every thread about a nice beach or a good restaurant, he was in the comments to let you know it was overrated or dangerous or full of other foreigners ruining it. And yet, 8 years. Still there. I've seen this before. In the job, you'd occasionally deal with men, usually men, who stayed in situations they claimed to despise, the neighborhood they kept saying they were going to leave. The job they swore was destroying them. The marriage, even. Bitterness had become load-bearing. If the thing they hated went away, they'd have nothing to organize their identity around. The bitter man wasn't in Cebu, despite the Philippines disappointing him. He was there because it had. That disappointment was the whole point now. Take it away, and he'd have to figure out who he actually was. I recognized that from the job. What I didn't clock immediately was that I recognized it a bit closer to home as well. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The second type appeared about a week in. I started thinking of him as the savior. He was from somewhere in the north of England. Recently divorced, I picked that up from comments he'd made on other threads, and he was building a house. On her family's land, in Batangas province, south of Manila. He posted updates every week, foundation photos, wall photos, roof photos. The caption under one of them was something like, "Coming along nicely, can't wait to start our life here." There was such naked pride in those posts. Not about the house, really. The house was beside the point. It was about being the man who built something. I sat with that one for a while. Because I'll be honest with you. If I'd found this group 6 months earlier, before I'd started doing even the most basic examination of my own motives, I think I'd have been posting those photos inside a year. I know I would. The need to be needed, I understand that need from the inside. I had 5 children and spent most of their childhoods working double shifts, and I'd turned around at some point and found that they'd built lives entirely without me, in them, not out of cruelty, just out of necessity. And there's a particular kind of man who responds to that by going looking for somewhere he can be indispensable again. Somewhere he can arrive with resources and competence and be seen as a solution rather than an absence. The Philippines, it turns out, is very good at making certain men feel like solutions. The third type I'd spotted by week 2. The king baby. 61 years old, from the Midlands somewhere. Coventry, I think, based on something he'd mentioned. His profile photo was him and a woman who looked to be in her big smiles. His hand around her waist with the proprietary ease of a man who'd recently been validated in ways he wasn't going to examine too closely. He posted about their relationship with a frequency that suggested he was still slightly amazed by it. The connection was real. She was mature beyond her years. She understood him in ways women his own age never had. I'm being unfair to him, maybe. I don't know his story, but I've sat across a table from men like that, in interview rooms, not relationships, and there's a specific quality to how they talk about the thing they want to believe. It's just slightly too insistent, slightly too complete. Real certainty doesn't need to keep announcing itself. The fourth type took me the longest to name, and when I did, I was the least comfortable about it. I ended up calling him the wallet on legs, which sounds cruel, and I don't mean it that way. This man was genuinely kind. I could see it in how he wrote. He was supporting her parents, her father had a bad back and couldn't work, and he was paying a sibling's college fees at one of the universities in Cebu, and there was something about a niece's school uniform costs. He talked about all of it openly and without resentment. He insisted the relationship was real, and I think he was probably right about that. I think she probably did love him, in her way. But he got confused somewhere along the line between being needed and being loved. And those are different things. They can exist together, but they're not the same thing, and if you've spent enough of your life confusing them, in a marriage, say, or 3 marriages, you'd probably do it again somewhere else. The Philippines didn't create that confusion in him. He arrived with it already packed. That's what I was sitting with on a wet Tuesday in Limerick, 3.5 weeks into reading this group, 4 Types of Man, and the uncomfortable recognition that I could map myself onto at least 3 of them, depending on which marriage you were talking about. With Siobhan, I'd been a version of the wallet on legs. Not financially, we were both young and broke, but emotionally. I'd thought being needed was the same as being loved, and when she left I genuinely hadn't understood the difference. With Patricia, I'd been a bit of a king baby, if the first. I'm being honest. I'd liked being seen as capable and authoritative, and a bit of a character. I'd liked the way she looked at me in the early years, before she stopped. And if I'd gone to the Philippines 6 months earlier, before this particular Tuesday, I'd have been that savior. Without question. Building something on someone else's land and posting the photos, I closed the laptop, made a cup of tea, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back garden, which I hadn't properly attended to since Deirdre left and which had gone somewhat wild. And I thought, right, before you do anything at all, you need to be honest about which one of those men you actually are. The problem with deciding to be honest with yourself is that you're still the one doing the deciding, and you're not exactly a neutral party. So I approached it the way I'd approach anything complicated. I made a list, not literally, I didn't sit down with a pen and paper like some sort of therapy exercise, but in my head the way I used to think through a case before an interview. What do I actually know? What am I assuming? Where are the gaps? What I knew, I was 63 years old, retired. 3 marriages, all failed. 5 children, largely absent. A pension that was comfortable in Ireland and would be generous in Southeast Asia, a house with a spare room full of boxes, and a YouTube algorithm that had clocked my loneliness with more precision than most people in my life had managed. What I was assuming, that I was different from those men in the group, more self-aware, more careful. That my 32 years reading people gave me some kind of protection. The gap, I had absolutely no evidence for any of that. None. A career spent reading other people's self-deception is not the same as being immune to your own. I knew this. I'd seen it in colleagues over the years. Good detectives who couldn't see what their marriages were doing, couldn't see what the drink was doing. Occupational hazard, maybe. You get very good at looking outward, so I stayed in the group. But I changed what I was doing. There, less lurking, more studying. And now I was studying myself as much as them. The savior posted a GoFundMe about a month in. Her mother needed dialysis. The machine cost around $180,000, roughly $2,900, and the ongoing treatment would be $8,000 a session, maybe 3 times a week. He'd written it up carefully, explained the situation, said any contribution would be a blessing. He used that word, blessing. And I noticed that, because it's a very Filipino English word to absorb into your own writing, and it suggested he'd been there long enough for the language to get into him a bit. My first reaction was sympathy, completely genuine. Dialysis is brutal. I know that. My own mother had an... My second reaction, about 4 seconds later, was suspicion. Was this real? Had he verified it? Had he been to the hospital himself, seen the paperwork? And then my third reaction, which I'm less proud of, which of those two instincts is the cop, and which one is the lonely man who wants to be the hero of this particular story? I didn't donate, but I came close, not because I thought the cause was genuine, I genuinely didn't know, but because I could feel the pull of it, the opportunity to be useful, to be the man who steps up. And that pull had nothing to do with dialysis and everything to do with Balinicura Road and the rectangular patch on the wall where Deirdre's mirror used to be. I didn't like that about myself, but there it was. She was young and she was lovely, and the whole tableau had a specific quality to it. Here's the unflattering truth. It looked nice, not the relationship. I still had reservations about the relationship. But the feeling in those photos, the being looked at quality, the sense of being someone's whole world, even briefly, that looked nice. I can't remember the last time any of my wives looked at me like that. Siobhan was too young and too overwhelmed. Patricia grew out of it. And Deirdre, well, I think Deirdre was always looking past me slightly, even at the start, and I just told myself I was imagining it. I was angry at myself for noticing the photos, for wanting what was in them, even a little. Felt like a confession I hadn't meant to make. But I wrote it down in my head under the honest column. You want to be looked at like that? Fine. Now, is that a good enough reason to go to the Philippines? Is that a foundation for anything real? Or is it just the king baby pathway with slightly better self-awareness? I did more structured research found a few actual expat forums, not Facebook groups, which tend toward performance, but older-style message boards where people wrote longer, less curated posts. Found some genuinely useful voices. Men who'd been there 10 years, had good relationships, were clear-eyed about how they'd got there and what it required. One thread I kept coming back to was about the legal realities. Property mostly. Foreigners can't own land in the Philippines, full stop, that's the law. You can own a condominium unit, but even then there are restrictions on how many units in a building. The workaround most men used was putting property in her name, which meant the moment the relationship ended, the property was hers, and there was very little legal recourse. I'd watched the savior posting his house photos and I thought, that house is not his. In any legal or practical sense, that house belongs to her family. He's building someone else, an asset, and calling it their future. The annulment situation came up too, which I hadn't known about. The Philippines has no divorce. None. It's one of only 2 countries on the planet with that distinction, and the other one is the Vatican, which at least has the excuse of being the Vatican. If a marriage breaks down in the Philippines, your only legal option is annulment, a completely different process, expensive, slow, takes years, costs anywhere from $30,000 to $800,000 or more, which works out to roughly $5,000 to $130,000 or more, which works out to roughly $5,000. And that's if it goes smoothly. which it often doesn't. And plenty of women in the country are still technically married to estranged Filipino men they haven't seen in 15 years, which creates all sorts of complications if a foreigner falls for them and starts making plans. I filed all of this under risk assessment. That's how I framed it to myself. Due diligence. But the videos about Cebu and Dumaguete I was watching in the evenings, those weren't risk assessment. Those were something else. Dumaguete kept coming up on the retirement forums as a different kind of place. Quieter, university town. Older people mentioned being able to walk to things, which at 63 matters more than it did at 40. I've been keeping all of this from Seon. Seon is my oldest friend, known him since primary school, and he has a very accurate bullshit detector where I'm concerned, because he's been watching me since we were 8 years old. I told him eventually, on a Thursday over a pint in Hannigan's, because I'd run out of ways to think about it alone, and I needed to hear it out loud. He listened, which is what Seon does. Doesn't jump in. Just lets you talk until you've said the actual thing rather than the version of the thing you meant to say. When I finished, he asked, "Are you going over there to find a woman?" I told him I was going traveling, wanted to see the country, pure tourism. He looked at me for a moment and then drank his Guinness. I booked the flights 2 weeks later. Cebu first, then Dumaguete, 3 weeks total. Aer Lingus to Dubai, then Cebu Pacific, on to Cebu. Cost me just over 900 return, which felt reasonable. I told myself I was going to see a place I'd been researching doesn't think more. I packed just the one. But I packed it. Mactan Cebu International Airport at 6 in the morning is not what you'd call a gentle introduction. You come off a long-haul flight already wrung out, and then the doors open and the heat just presents itself. Not aggressively, not a wall of it the way people describe. More like the air has a weight to it that Irish air doesn't have. Humid. Dense. Like breathing through warm flannel. I stood outside the arrivals hall waiting for my grab, and a man nearby was eating something from a plastic bag. I didn't know what it was, some kind of rice thing wrapped in banana leaf, and the smell of it mixed with the diesel from the jeepneys idling at the curb. And I thought, right, you're not in Limerick anymore. The Grab driver had the radio on, some Filipino pop song I didn't recognize, and he was cheerful in the way that Cebuano people often are at 6 in the morning, which I found mildly offensive, given the hour. He asked where I was from. Ireland, I said. He'd never met an Irish person before. He asked if I knew Conor McGregor. I told him I didn't, personally. He seemed slightly disappointed. The hotel was a mid-range place in IT Park. I'd picked it deliberately. Not the 5-star resort option, not the guest house that looked like it charged by the hour. A clean, functional business hotel where the air conditioning worked and the Wi-Fi was reliable, and nobody was going to assume anything about why I was there. About $3,200 a night, which is roughly 51. Reasonable. The kind of choice that felt like a statement of intent, even if I couldn't have told you exactly what the intent was. I slept for 4 hours, ate something from the 7-Eleven across the road, a rice meal in a container, 95, about 9:35, about 9:35, and genuinely not bad, and then went out to see the city. The first week, I did it properly. Magellan's Cross in the morning, which is older than anything in Ireland by several centuries, and sits inside a chapel that smells of incense and old wood and candle wax in a way that's absolutely familiar if you grew up going to Mass, which I did, even if it didn't stick. The Basilica Minore del Santo Niño is right beside it, packed even on a Tuesday, families with children, old women in mantillas, a queue to touch a statue of the Christ child that dates back to Magellan's time. I stood at the back and watched for a while. The devotion was real. That's not something you can perform at that scale. I took a day trip south, hired a driver through the hotel for a 3,500, about 56, and went down to Mawalbo on the western coast. There's a sardine run there, millions of the things moving in formation off the beach, and you can snorkel with them for almost nothing. I'm not a snorkeling man particularly, but I'd read about it and it seemed like the kind of thing you'd be a fool to miss. The driver waited 3 hours reading his phone while I went in the water and watched sardines move like one enormous silver thought. It was very good, actually. One of the better afternoons I've had in recent memory. I'm telling you all this because I want you to understand that I was genuinely trying to see the place, not just using it as a backdrop for whatever I'd come to find. The Philippines is a real country with real things in it, and I wanted to behave like someone who understood that. But you can only be a tourist for so long before the other thing surfaces. I downloaded Tinder on the third evening, sat in the hotel room, told myself it was just to see, purely observational, the cop doing reconnaissance. Had it open for perhaps an hour before the first message came in, which, in hindsight, tells you something about the market conditions. I had 4 conversations over the next few days. The first 2 I'd clock within about 3 exchanges. Not because they were doing anything wrong exactly, they were warm and attentive and asked good questions, but there was a polish to it. The messages landed at perfectly calibrated intervals. The personal details were just specific enough to feel real, but never quite followed up on. Professional. And I mean that without judgment. These were women who'd developed a skill, and the skill was considerable. But it was a skill nonetheless, and I recognized it the way you recognize craftsmanship. You don't have to disapprove of a thing to know what it is. The third was a student, 26 years old, studying nursing at one of the universities on the island. She was genuinely curious, I think. Asked me questions that didn't feel scripted, laughed at something I said that wasn't particularly designed to be funny. But she was 26, and I'm 63. And whatever I'd told myself about the King Baby's Boracay photos, I wasn't willing to become the thing I'd been quietly judging. I wished her well and closed the conversation. Felt quite good about that, actually. Small victories. The fourth was harder to walk away from. A nurse, mid-30s, worked at a private hospital in the city. Her English was excellent. Her manner was direct without being aggressive, and she had an actual sense of humor rather than the performed version of one. We talked for 2 days. Good conversation. Real conversation. On the third exchange, she mentioned her son's school fees. Not as a request, she was careful about that, framed it as context, just explaining her situation, a single mother managing on a nurse's salary, which in the Philippines is considerably less than you'd think for the work involved. Private hospital nursing in Cebu might pay 205,000 to 35,000 to 235,000 a month, roughly C5,000 to 2,560. The school fees she mentioned were 18,000 a semester, about 2,290. In the context of her salary, that's a serious cost. I understood all of that. Not the content, the shape. The way the information had been placed, just at the point where we'd established enough warmth that it carried emotional weight, just vague enough that it wasn't technically a request. I thought of the wallet on legs posting in the Facebook group. Genuinely kind, genuinely generous, and confused, somewhere along the line, about what he was paying for. I stepped back from that conversation. Didn't ghost her. I told her I was going to be off the app while I was traveling, which was partially true. She wished me well and said she hoped I enjoyed Cebu, and that was that. I deleted Tinder that evening, sat on the edge of the hotel bed and deleted it, and felt neither proud nor disappointed, just accurate. Like I'd taken my own temperature and got a reading I could use. The second week finished, and I took the bus south toward the ferry terminal. Dumaguete was a 2-hour crossing from Cebu's southern tip, and the ferry, An ordinary ro-ro vessel, nothing glamorous, 250 for the crossing, about 2.4, took me across the strait to Negros Oriental. As the sun was getting lower and the water went from green to something closer to purple, Cebu City runs at a particular pitch. It's a business city, a port city, everything moving at speed. Dumaguete runs at a different pitch entirely. There's a boulevard along the waterfront called Rizal Boulevard, where people walk in the evenings, families and students and old men on benches, and the pace of it was the pace of somewhere that wasn't trying to impress you. University Town. Silliman University is right in the city, the oldest American-founded university in Asia, someone told me, established by missionaries in 1901, and it gives the place a kind of intellectual texture you don't always find in Philippine cities of that size. There were expats, yes, but older ones, quieter ones, men in their 60s and 70s eating breakfast at the same tables every morning with a settled quality about them, like people who had made a decision and were living inside it rather than still making it. I found that reassuring. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but I found it reassuring. I checked into a small hotel near the boulevard. 2,200 a night, about $235. A room with a ceiling fan and a view of the water, and, at 4 in the morning on the first night, a rooster somewhere nearby that had a very particular opinion about the darkness and felt compelled to share it at considerable volume. One lay there listening to it and thought, for the first time in a long time, that I was somewhere I hadn't been before, not just geographically. And that's when the hotel manager introduced me to Maritza. Her full name was Marites Villanueva de la Cruz, and she introduced herself as Marites, not Mrs. de la Cruz, which I noticed because it's the kind of small signal that tells you something about a person, not performing her widowhood, just herself. The hotel manager, a small, efficient man named Rodell who'd been watching me eat alone for 4 evenings and had apparently decided this was his personal problem to solve, knocked on my door on the 5th night and told me there was a group dinner happening at a restaurant 2 streets away, some locals and long-term residents who met irregularly, and that I was welcome if I wanted company. He said it the way you'd offer something to a stray cat. Matter of fact, no pressure. I said yes, mostly because I'd been talking to myself at mealtimes, and it was starting to concern me. The restaurant was a family-run place near the market, the kind with plastic chairs and overhead fans and handwritten menus on a chalkboard. They'd pushed 3 tables together. 8 people total. A retired American couple from Oregon who'd been in Dumaguete 11 years, 2 Filipino men who worked at Silliman, a Dutch woman who ran a small ceramics business, and Marites, who was sitting at the far end reading something on her phone when I arrived and looked up and said hello without any particular fuss about it. I sat across from her because it was the available seat, not by design. She asked me within the first 5 minutes what I read. Not what I did, not where I was from, not the usual tourist-handling questions. What do you read? I was caught off guard enough that I answered honestly, crime fiction mostly, Ian Rankin and the like, some history, and then I mentioned almost accidentally that I'd been reading a bit of self-help since retiring, and she laughed. Not unkindly, just genuinely amused. She asked why I was embarrassed about the self-help. I told her because men my age aren't supposed to read self-help. She said that was a very stupid rule. This is different. She taught secondary school for 31 years, English and Filipino literature, which explained the reading question. Her husband, Rodrigo, had been a civil engineer, died 6 years ago of a stroke, she mentioned it plainly, without performance of grief, the way you talk about a fact that's simply part of your landscape now. They'd had 1 daughter, currently in Manila working in healthcare administration. She had a house 3 streets from where we were sitting that she'd owned outright for 20 years. She had no particular interest in going in. I've told those stories in pubs from Limerick to London, and they generally land well. The Garda anecdotes, the interview room experiences, the occasional genuinely strange thing that happens in 32 years of policing. She listened attentively, smiled in the right places. And when I finished one about a particularly elaborate fraud case I'd worked in the 90s, she said, "That's very interesting," and then asked me a question about the perpetrator's psychology that was considerably more perceptive than the question I'd been expecting. I'd been expecting admiration. I recalibrated, told a shorter story, a more honest one, about a case I'd handled badly and what it cost a family. She leaned forward slightly, asked more questions. We talked for, I don't know, an hour and a half, maybe two, and at some point I noticed that everyone else at the table had shifted into different conversations and we'd simply stayed where we were. The next morning I replayed it and tried to identify what had happened. The cop habit. And what I came back to was this. Every time I was performing, the experienced detective, the seasoned traveler, the man who'd seen things, she received it politely and waited. Every time I was simply talking, honest, unguarded, occasionally at my own expense, she engaged. Fully. Like a different circuit had been switched on. I'd been doing the wrong thing for so long I'd forgotten there was a right thing. We met twice more at the group dinners. On the third day she suggested coffee. Mentioned a place near Silliman where the coffee was good and the noise level was low enough to have an actual conversation. I said yes. When the bill came, she put her share on the table before I'd even reached for my wallet, and the matter-of-factness of it, no ceremony, no performance of reluctance, just her half of 280, about 4W30, appearing on the table, struck me as the most clarifying thing that had happened all trip. I'd been waiting, I realized. Somewhere in the back of my mind, from the moment I'd arrived in the Philippines, I'd been waiting for the ask, not consciously. But the readiness was there. The part of me that was also the wallet on legs, that part was always alert to it. And it hadn't come. Not from Maritz. On the third day, I made a misstep. We'd been talking about the video calls I'd been planning to have with my daughter in Melbourne, and I said something about how easy it was to stay connected across distance these days, and I phrased it in a way that was slightly loaded, something about how it would be good to keep in touch when I was home, with a weight to it that was more than just pleasantness. She received it warmly. Agreed that yes, it would be good to stay in touch. Mentioned she had a friend in Dublin she video-called monthly, and moved on. She'd handled me, gently, thoroughly, without any drama whatsoever. And I knew immediately that I'd been handled because 32 years of interview rooms gives you a very good sense of when a conversation has been redirected, and she'd done it with more grace than I'd have managed. I felt, oddly, glad about it. On the last full day, sitting outside a cafe on Rizal Boulevard watching a pair of dogs sleep in the shade of a parked tricycle, she told me quite directly that she had no interest in moving to Ireland. Said she'd buried a husband here, raised a daughter here, and that she was 61 and happy where she was. She said Ireland sounded cold, which is not inaccurate. I told her it was extremely cold. She said she'd suspected as much. I didn't know then, and I still don't know now, what exactly we were to each other after 6 days. Not a romance, or not yet. But something real had happened, and I was fairly certain it was real because nothing had been sold to me. No performance, no carefully managed impression. Just a woman who read books and paid her share of the coffee and was unimpressed by my best stories and more interested in what they said about me than in the stories themselves. I flew to Manila to connect home the following morning. Overnight, in a hotel near the airport, 2,800, about 45, and a very early departure. At the airport, in that particular state of tiredness that long journeys produce, old habit. The Bitterman had posted about a scam he'd witnessed at a market in Cebu. The savior had uploaded new photos. The roof was on now. The house was taking shape. The caption said something about a new chapter. The wallet on legs had asked a practical question about Gcash transfer limits for sending money to a third party. I read it for 20 minutes. Then I closed the app. I haven't opened it since. Her full name was Maritz Villanueva de la Cruz, and she introduced herself as Maritz, not Mrs. Presticle de la Cruz, which I noticed because it's the kind of small signal that tells you something about a person, not performing her widowhood, just herself. Matter of fact, no pressure. I said yes, mostly because I'd been talking to myself at mealtimes, and it was starting to concern me. The restaurant was a family-run place near the market, the kind with plastic chairs and overhead fans and handwritten menus on a chalkboard. They'd pushed 3 tables together. 8 people total. A retired American couple from Oregon who'd been in Dumaguete 11 years, 2 Filipino men who worked at Silliman, a Dutch woman who ran a small ceramics business, and Maritz, who was sitting at the far end reading something on her phone when I arrived and looked up and said hello without any particular fuss about it. I sat across from her because it was the available seat, not by design. She asked me within the first 5 minutes what I read. Not what I did, not where I was from, not the usual tourist handling questions. What do you read? I was caught off guard enough that I answered honestly, crime fiction mostly, Ian Rankin and the like, some history, and then I mentioned almost accidentally that I'd been reading a bit of self-help since retiring, and she laughed, not unkindly, just genuinely amused. She asked why I was embarrassed about the self-help. I told her because men my age aren't supposed to read self-help. She said that was a very stupid rule, and I thought, right, this is different. She taught secondary school for 31 years. English and Filipino literature, which explained the reading. Her husband, Rodrigo, had been a civil engineer, died 6 years ago of a stroke. She mentioned it plainly, without performance of grief, the way you talk about a fact that's simply part of your landscape now. They'd had 1 daughter, currently in Manila working in healthcare administration. She had a house 3 streets from where we were sitting that she'd owned outright for 20 years. She had no particular interest in going anywhere. I tried the job stories. She had no particular interest in going anywhere. I've told those stories in pubs from Limerick to London, and they generally land well. The Garda anecdotes, the interview room experiences, the occasional genuinely strange thing that happens in 32 years of policing. She listened attentively, smiled in the right places. And when I finished one about a particularly elaborate fraud case I'd worked in the 90s, she said, "That's very interesting," and then asked me a question about the perpetrator's psychology that was considerably more perceptive than the question I'd been expecting. I'd been expecting admiration. I got a I recalibrated. Told a shorter story, a more honest one, about a case I'd handled badly and what it cost a family. She leaned forward slightly. Asked more questions. We talked for, I don't know, an hour and a half, maybe 2. And at some point I noticed that everyone else at the table had shifted into different conversations, and we'd simply stayed where we were. The next morning I replayed it and tried to identify what had happened. The cop habit. And what I came back to was this. Every time I was performing, the experienced detective, the seasoned traveler, the man who'd seen things, she received it politely and waited. Every time I was simply talking, honest, unguarded, occasionally at my own expense, she engaged, fully. like a different circuit had been switched on. I'd been doing the wrong thing for so long I'd forgotten there was a right thing. We met twice more at the group dinners. On the third day she suggested coffee. Mentioned a place near Silliman where the coffee was good and the noise level was low enough to have an actual conversation. I said yes. When the bill came, she put her share on the table before I'd even reached for my wallet. And the matter-of-factness of it, no ceremony, no performance of reluctance, just her half of 2 about 2.40, appearing on the table, struck me as the most clarifying thing that had happened all trip. I'd been waiting, I realized. Somewhere in the back of my mind, from the moment I'd arrived in the Philippines, but the readiness was there. The part of me that was also the wallet on legs, that part was always alert to it. And it hadn't come, not from Marites. On the third day I made a misstep. We'd been talking about the video calls I'd been planning to have with my daughter in Melbourne, and I said something about how easy it was to stay connected across distance these days. And I phrased it in a way that was slightly loaded, something about how it would be good to keep in touch when I was home, with a weight to it that was more than just pleasantness. She received it warmly. Agreed that, yes, it would be good to stay in touch. Mentioned she had a friend in Dublin she video-called monthly, and moved on. She'd handled me. Gently, thoroughly, without any drama whatsoever. And I knew immediately that I'd been handled because 32 years of interview rooms gives you a very good sense of when a conversation has been redirected, and she'd done it with more grace than I'd have managed. I felt, oddly, glad about it. On the last full day, sitting outside a cafe on Rizal Boulevard watching a pair of dogs sleep in the shade of a parked tricycle, she told me quite directly that she had no interest in moving to Ireland. Said she'd buried a husband here, raised a daughter here, and that she was 61 and happy where she was. She said Ireland sounded cold, which is not inaccurate. I told her it was extremely cold. She said she'd suspected as much. I didn't know then, and I still don't know now, what exactly we were to each other after 6 days. Not a romance, or not yet, or not in any shape, but something real had happened, and I was fairly certain it was real because nothing had been sold to me. No performance, no carefully managed impression. Just a woman who read books and paid her share of the coffee and was unimpressed by my best stories and more interested in what they said about me than in the stories themselves. I flew to Manila to connect home the following morning. Overnight, in a hotel near the airport, 2,800, about 2,800, about 2,800. At the airport, in that particular state of tiredness that long journeys produce. Old habit. The Bitterman had posted about a scam he'd witnessed at a market in Cebu. The savior had uploaded new photos. The roof was on now. The house was taking shape. The caption said something about a new chapter. The wallet on legs had asked a practical question about Gcash transfer limits for sending money to a third party. I read it for 20 minutes. Then I closed the app. I haven't opened it since. That was 14 months ago. 14 months, and I'm sitting in the same kitchen on Balanakura Road, the same table that seats one, the same rectangular patch on the wall. Some things haven't changed, but the Tuesday silences are different now. On Tuesdays at 7 in the evening, Irish time, my phone rings on Messenger. It's Wednesday morning in Dumaguete, 8 hours ahead, and Marites will have had her coffee already and will be sitting somewhere with good light. The calls run anywhere from 40 minutes to 2 hours, depending on what we've got into. Last week it was the Irish housing crisis, which she found genuinely baffling, and then somehow we ended up on the subject of grief. Specifically, how long is a reasonable amount of time to be angry at a person who's died? Which came up because she'd been thinking about Rodrigo and something he'd done years ago that still irritated her. I told her I thought the statute of limitations on anger at the dead was probably longer than people admitted. She agreed. We went around on it for a while. I've told her about the marriages. All three. Shaban and the job taking everything. Patricia and the 7 years of qualified absence. Deirdre, whom I still can't fully explain, and I told her that too, that I don't have a clean account of it yet, that the evidence keeps shifting depending on when I look at it. She listened without filling in the gaps for me, which is rarer than it sounds. She told me about Rodrigo's last 2 years, when the strokes were happening incrementally, and he knew what was coming, and they both pretended not to know together, which she said was actually quite tender in its way, the joint pretending. I didn't have anything useful to say about that, so I said so. And she said that was fine. She wasn't looking for anything useful. In 6 weeks, I'm going back. 4 weeks this time, all of it in Dumaguete. I've booked the flights, Aer Lingus to Dubai, Cebu Pacific again, same route. About 1,050 this time, prices have gone up slightly. I've arranged to stay at a different hotel, slightly cheaper, person 1,800 a night, about Odin 29, because I'll be there long enough that paying 2,200 seemed unnecessary. Maritz has mentioned showing me the market properly, and Apo Island, which is a marine reserve an hour or so down the coast with coral reef diving that she says is extraordinary. I don't dive, but apparently you can snorkel. I seem to be becoming a snorkeling man. I don't know what the trip becomes. I genuinely don't. And for the first time in my life, I'm not in a hurry to name it. Now, the 4 types. I said I'd come back to them, and I will, because I think about them more than I expected to. The Bitterman. I have more sympathy for him now than I did in Limerick reading his posts with my teeth, because I understand what happened to him. He went looking for something, and the something was never really about the Philippines. It was about whatever he'd left behind, whatever had broken or emptied out before he ever boarded a plane. And when the Philippines didn't fix it, because it couldn't, because that's not what places do, the disappointment calcified into bitterness. And the bitterness is still grief. Just grief. Just grief that's found no way out. 8 years on, the Bitterman is still grieving and calling it the country's fault. I'm sorry for him. I am. The Savior. That's my one. The category I'd have fallen into face first if the timing had been different. I understand the Savior completely because I understand what drives him, which is the need to be needed, which I've had since I was probably 30 years old and just didn't have language for. I had 5 children and managed to be a stranger to most of their childhoods, not through cruelty, through absence and the job and the particular blindness that comes with being very capable in public and completely useless in private. The house in Batangas is a monument to that need. He's building indispensability, a structure that proves he matters to someone. I don't judge it. I just couldn't afford it. Because I know myself well enough now to know that if I built that house, I'd have needed the gratitude to keep coming, and when the gratitude became expectation and the expectation became the baseline, I'd have been lost. You can't build anything on a performance, because the moment the performance needs to be sustained rather than felt, it starts to collapse. And at 65 years old, I've watched that collapse 3 times. I know what it looks like from the inside, the wallet on legs. This one I've turned over the most, because I want to be careful with him. I said earlier that he's confused being needed with being loved. And I think that's true, but I also want to be fair about what he's inside. He's inside a real relationship, probably. And in that real relationship there are real obligations. Her parents are genuinely ill, the college fees are genuinely necessary. These are not fabrications. The obligation is real. What he may not have fully reckoned with is that the obligation was always going to be there, and the question is whether you enter it with open eyes or whether you enter it believing love will feel different from this. Maybe it won't feel different from this. Maybe this is what it is. I don't know. He has to decide if he can live inside it. That's his answer to find. The Philippines didn't create any of those men. I want to be clear about that. Every single one of them arrived with their damage already assembled and packed. The job, the divorce, the children who didn't call, the marriage that ended without a clean story, all of it was already in the suitcase. What the Philippines did, what it does, is remove the cushioning. Back home, you're a lonely man, but you're a lonely man with context. The job was demanding. She wasn't right for you. The country is cold and the culture doesn't favor emotional openness. The excuses are plausible and nearby, and they hold the shape of you. Over there, the excuses fall away. You're just a man with money in a place that will show you exactly what you are. No context, no plausible reasons. Just the man himself, sitting across from his own reflection. Most men don't like what they see, so they call it the Philippines. I saw it. Barely. I'd been 4 clicks away from the savior, and the only thing that changed the trajectory was a few weeks of sitting alone in a Limerick kitchen being honest with myself before I got on the plane. That's all. A few weeks of uncomfortable self-examination and one conversation with Seon that I lied through and then felt bad about. I don't have it figured out. I want to be clear about that too. I'm 65 years old with 3 failed marriages and 5 kids who send voice messages at Christmas. And I'm video calling a woman in Dumaguete twice a week, and I still don't know what to call it. But I know which direction I'm facing. And I know which direction I'm facing. And I know I'm facing it honestly, or more honestly than I have before. The call's at 7. I should go. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know we don't often get stories like his. No wire transfer, no confrontation, no devastating financial reckoning at the end. Just a man who did something genuinely difficult before he ever boarded a plane. He looked at himself honestly, without flattery. And he kept looking until the picture was accurate. The title of this video asks what kinds of foreigners Filipino women avoid. But Brendan's story answers a different question, which is the one underneath that one. What kind of man are you, really? Because it will show you. That's the one thing every story on this channel agrees on. Whatever else they disagree about. The Philippines is a place of 110 million people, with a culture of extraordinary depth and complexity, a culture built around family, faith, obligation, community, and a kind of resilience that most of us from wealthier countries can barely imagine. It deserves to be met with honesty and respect and some degree of self-knowledge. It is not a backdrop for someone else's midlife crisis. It is not a fix for what broke you. The men who go well, and some do go well genuinely, are the ones who arrive with their eyes open, who know something about their own patterns before the patterns play out somewhere new. Brendan knew. Just barely. Just in time. If you've got a story you'd like to share with us here at Inside the Philippines, the details are below. And if this one stayed with you, if one of those 4 types felt a little too familiar, that's probably worth sitting with for a while. We'll see you in the next one.